a discussion about dress and appearance standards across federal agencies, including the Department of Defense. Today, May 22nd, 2023. Good morning, Early Birds. I'm Jonathan Lehrfeld, and this is the Early Bird Brief, produced by Defense News and Military Times. Today, podcast producer and Military Times reporter Simone Perez talked with Federal Times reporter Molly Weisner. They discussed changes to office wardrobe culture for federal employees, including those at the Department of Defense, especially as the COVID-19 pandemic has waned and employees return to in-person work.
So, Molly, thank you for joining the podcast today.
Hi, Z. Thanks for having me.
So, I was just curious. You wrote a story about government clothing standards.
I sure did.
What kind of got that started, and what exactly is the story about?
We're in a period of transition, and by we, I mean the federal government. For the last 2-3 years, and even before that, employees have been able to work from home, work remotely, and during the pandemic, whether you worked in government or not, I think all of us hung up our ties, put away our sport coats, and started wearing athleisure, or at the very least, wearing something professional from the waist up, because most of the work was done without ever having to step foot out of our house. We were only looking at people on computer monitors. So the change that we might be seeing, it's not entirely clear yet, but the change that we might be seeing is a substantial increase in in-person work. Earlier last month, on April 13th, the Office of Management and Budget within the White House sent out this memo saying, look, agencies, you need to assess your work environment, figure out what has been working well, what hasn't been working with regard to remote work and telework flexibilities. And they threw in a detail that sort of catalyzed a lot of questions, basically saying that they're expecting to increase, quote, meaningful in-person work, end quote. So the question became, if that happens, are we all going to be dusting off our suits in the advent of in-person work to continue? So we asked that question of about 600 federal employees, and they answered.
Interesting. And just a quick sidebar, what did any sources tell you is defined as meaningful in-person work? I can imagine that there could be some discrepancies between what managers and their subordinates view as meaningful in-person activities.
Absolutely. And in fact, an Eagle Consulting survey published earlier this week actually indicated that government employees generally expect that the decision about whether to telework or remote work lies with their supervisor, not necessarily with the head of the agency. So it's really going to be interesting to see how agencies define that. OMB and OPM have generally been supportive of agencies having the latitude to decide what's best for their workforce, but you know, the jury's still out on that. We don't really know. Obviously, Republicans in Congress, in the House, they've passed a bill that would force people to come back to offices, and there's a Senate companion bill that's gaining some steam. So if Congress has its way, they might force agencies to clearly define how many days a week or a pay period folks have to come to the office. We don't know yet. Certainly, though, I think that's at the front of everybody's mind.
What were the results or some of the interesting findings of the survey that more than 600 federal employees responded to?
Yeah, so the overarching finding was that if folks' dress code even changed at all because of the pandemic, it became more casual. Some people said it became a lot more casual, some said just a little bit. Very few, only a handful, said that they're actually dressing more formally than they were now versus during the pandemic. But you have to remember, general society, I think, has been trending more casually. This is not a phenomenon that is exclusive to the federal government. And so I think it's not surprising that this has been a in-process transition, and it just reflects what's going on across the country. But that being said, about 46% of the respondents said that their agencies have a dress code, and 12% said that they had one even in virtual meetings. So I think that's interesting because it speaks to the fact that there are expectations out there. They might just differ depending on the work you do, the agency you work for, things like that.
Definitely. And so what are the most popular back to the office clothes in these findings?
Yeah, so think about Washington, D.C., right? And then compare it to Los Angeles or New York City. I think most people would say, and we've actually talked to some fashion experts about this, that DC has a very conservative style, and I'm not talking about politically. I'm talking that it is very common for folks, especially who work in government, on the Hill, to wear muted, monochrome colors. You're not going to see, by and large, a whole lot of flashy colors or patterns or prints or ruffles. Historically, at least that's the case. So now what's most common, it's still pretty close to that. A lot of folks are wearing your navies, your blacks, your grays, your browns, khakis, if not proper slacks, shoes that are dress shoes or heels for women, although I think it's fair to say that a lot of folks are now wearing flats or smaller heels or boots or things that are more comfortable to walk in, especially if they have to commute. We're seeing a lot of folks who are holding on to their sport coats. I think fewer people may be breaking out the full coordinated suit, and instead we're just going for suit separates. So I might throw on a blazer over a pair of pants that still look nice, but it might not be the three-piece suit with a top hat and coattails and things like that. But I think business casual and business professional is still very much alive here. At least that's what the survey indicated.
Now let's talk about, for our listeners, the Pentagon, which plays in many ways legislatively, politically, clothing-wise, in some ways plays by its own set of rules. In the Pentagon on a given day, there's troops, there's service members in uniform, there's civilians, there's contractors, there's a whole variety of folks with perhaps different standards for what is expected of them. So anything different from the Pentagon that you found, unlike other agencies across the rest of the federal government?
Yeah, so you're right. The Pentagon in many ways operates as its own sort of island. But let's think about who you're going to find any given day walking into the Pentagon. You've got military service members, civilian employees, contractors, people who are visiting, subject matter experts, folks from agencies, but you've also got members of the public, perhaps. You've also got folks who are working in the cafes and in the little food stops inside the Pentagon. So I don't think you could say that there is one particular type of dress in the Pentagon. And the reason for it is because, at least according to the survey respondents, how you dress depends on who you're going to see that day and the job that you do. So what do I mean by that? One of the folks in the survey said that they work for a defense civilian agency, but when they have to go meet with a high-ranking official, or if they're even interfacing with the public and they're sort of the face of their agency, they're going to set dressier standards for themselves. Think about any time that military experts or even service members have to go testify before Congress. They're not going to show up with their collar unbuttoned and with some rumpled khaki pants. I mean, think about just the recent 2024 budget request hearing for the Department of Defense. You had Secretary Austin and General Milley testifying, and both of them looked very buttoned up. So I think that speaks a lot to there's an expectation, whether you're a service member or whether you're a civilian employee in the Pentagon, that you're going to dress a certain way, especially if you're going to be in the public eye or especially if you're going to be meeting with high-ranking officials or leaders.
Which just might be a little less leeway than the rest of the federal workforce.
I think so. I mean, if anybody is going to have very clear standards for how to dress, it's the military, right? Civilian agencies, you got to remember, there is no government-wide dress code issued by OPM. So agencies can set a dress code for themselves. But I think in the military, people get in trouble if they are, out of regulation. So I think in that world, it's part of the culture, yes, but fashion for the military is not for fashion, it's for function. And it's to be able to easily identify without even having to introduce yourself who that person is, the job that they do, what their rank is. You don't even have to ask them because based on how they dress, they're quickly identifiable, and they're also wearing clothes that makes doing their job easy. I mean, there's a reason that they're not out here with their loose shirts on military installations, or if they're working with heavy machinery, it's a safety hazard. So I think function guides fashion in the Pentagon, and especially for service members. I think the other place that you'll see more rigorous or explicit standards for dress and attire is for federal employees or military service members who are, as a representative of their agency or of the U.S., going abroad. And so, there's a Naval Forces Central Command policy memo that lays this idea out that says, in order to project a good impression to host nation populations, as well as reinforce policy of liberty as a mission, civilian attire shall present a neat, conservative appearance. So I wasn't lying when I said that, the expectation among government and military for dress tends to swing conservatively because, again, many of these people are representing their agency on behalf of broader government, on behalf of the broader U.S., whether they're standing before constituents in small-town America or they're abroad. People tend to take notice of that, and I think for service members, it's not at all unusual, again, for them to have a very clear expectation or at least a very clear tradition of what is and isn't acceptable.
Well, Molly Weisner, first a federal government expert, now a fashionista. Thank you for joining us today on the podcast.
Thank you for having me. This was fun.
That's it for us this morning. To get more of the top stories and breaking news, go to defensenews.com/EBB to subscribe to the Early Bird Brief newsletter. Please give us a like, rating, and a comment wherever you get your podcasts. And be sure to follow us on social media @defense_news and @Military Times. The Early Bird Brief is hosted by me, Jonathan Lehrfeld, and produced by Simone Z. Perez. If you liked our conversation today, be sure to check out Molly's work at federaltimes.com. Also, please rate us and leave a comment on whatever platform you use. Our editor-in-chief is Mike Gruss. Have a great day.